And we're back. In this portion, I want to talk about uh, the road to the American Revolution. Okay, continuing what I had just spoken about, and the year 1763 being I guess the high water mark, or the as one author calls it, the high summer of the First British Empire. Um, I want to make note of the fact that in the next couple of weeks, you should be prepared to view um, a number, 3 to 4 episodes of what is called John Adams. It was an HBO miniseries, and you may find that on Amazon or YouTube for a nominal purchase. Okay, um, these episodes are it's, first of all, extremely well written. It's uh, based on a book, John Adams, um, written by the historian David McCullough, and David McCullough had a big hand in making the this mini series that was out a few years ago. Um, and this at this time I'm going to be talking about, and you will be writing about episode one, okay, of John Adams. More about that as we go along. But again, let let's talk about 1763 as being that watershed year for uh, British the British American Empire. The British, the first of all, the colonists again, they were feeling full of themselves. They felt they were fully and properly English. They had contributed and fought side by side with the British in the Seven Years' War, the French and Indian War, and this has led to a victory, and the British victory that drives New France completely off the map. There is no, it wipes out New France and drives um, the French crown out of possession of North America. The French colonists are still there. They are now to be dominated by British government and British rule and the British forces. Um, and while the Seven Years' War and the French and Indian War were British victories, tremendous victories, at the same time it leaves Great Britain in near financial collapse, financial ruin. Okay, um, imperial planners, the British planners, saw the Americans prospering under the English government and concluded that it was time to start levying direct taxes on the colonies, on their economies. The the, the English colonies were prospering greatly, and the British Crown and the British government felt that they weren't paying their fair share. Okay, um, and it was time for them to ante up, to pony up their fair share of having having protection of the British Army and Navy, the premier military force in the world, the most powerful Army and Navy in the world, were watching over the British colonies, and the British King and Parliament felt that the colonists should pay their fair share. Um, so in 1765, Parliament passes. Remember, Parliament is the democratically elected legislature in London. Um, but also remember that this popularly elected democratic legislature that made the laws for uh, king and country, um, were um, had no representatives from the colonies. Okay, the colonies did not have members of parliament speaking for them. So in 1765, the Stamp Act is passed. Okay, 1765, the Stamp Act. requiring all legal documents, newspapers, college diplomas, and other products of the print trade, um, to display a revenue stamp. Okay, and any of those documents, any of those pieces of paper had to have a government stamp on it, paid government stamp on it, or you were not in compliance. Okay, you were breaking the law. And the Stamp Act in 1765 is the time when, as has been said, the lid blows off in North America. Okay, the North American colonists had developed their own legislatures, as we've said before. Their legislatures were the only places where the colonists felt that their interests were being represented. Since they didn't have any representatives in Parliament, they didn't feel that Parliament was looking out for their interests. Parliament was in London. They're 6,000 miles away across the Atlantic. They had their own legislatures, and they had their own legislators who were passing laws and doing the people's business over in the 13 colonies. So they felt that the legitimate government was their own local government. Okay, the Stamp Act didn't last long. Okay, for a number of reasons, bootlegging, um, and organizations that might. They weren't terrorist organizations, but they certainly were rabble rousers. Mobs threatened the agents who were collecting the revenue from the Stamp Act. Like I said, clubs or societies called like the Loyal Nine, or more prominently, you've heard of the Sons of Liberty. And if you watch the first episode of John, when you watch the first episode of John Adams, you will see the Sons of Liberty, and a man in particular named Samuel Adams. You might know the name from the beer Samuel Adams, Boston Lager, Boston Brewing Company, as a matter of fact. And that's named after the Patriot, the Boston, New England Patriot, Samuel Adams, first cousin to our John Adams. But in any case, the Sons of Liberty, they're a clandestine organization that is looking to not have the Stamp Act continue. Okay, they have meetings, they have assemblies, they have parades, all against the Stamp Act. And the colonists, because they feel that the Stamp Act is not for them, in October of 1765, the Stamp Act Congress is convened, okay, to give a response to the king, basically saying, we don't feel that this law is just because it's made without us having any kind of representation in Parliament. Therefore, it's not legit, and therefore, if you continue with this tax, with the Stamp Act tax, we'll boycott. We'll boycott British goods. Okay, and as we said before, 50% of everything that was exported from Britain to the colonies, or I should say, 50% of British goods were going to the British colonies. So that's half of their revenue being affected by a boycott. And so this boycott, not just on the Stamp Act goods, but on all British imports. Parliament gets the message. It repeals the Stamp Act in 1766. Less than a year later, in fact, 6 months later. Am I right? Well, at least no more than a year later. The Stamp Act is repealed, but it's replaced by what are called the Declaratory Acts, and based upon the principle that Parliament's right to pass legislation includes tax legislation for the colonies. They repeal the Stamp Act at the same and declare these declaratory acts, and really bringing it home to the colonists that uh, we don't want to hear you. Okay, these laws are being passed by Parliament, and they're for all. If you're a British subject, you live in a British colony, you're going to pay these. Besides, look at the amount of debt, the ruin that we almost come to because of your French and Indian War. Okay, right, the colonists, French and Indian War. And what the declaratory acts also, if you read between the lines, and the colonists certainly were reading between the lines, they felt that now the king and parliament were treating them, the 13 British colonies, as no more than settlements. Okay, that the local legislatures and these British subjects that had made their own way and made all things England in North America. Now they're nothing more. They're going back. They're reverting. They're regressing back to the status of settlements. And the colonists, the idea of self-government in the colonies was not being recognized here. In 1767, Parliament tries again to impose a scheme of taxes on the colonial economies in the form of duties on a variety of imported commodities. This attempt at taxation really infuriated the colonies even further. The Sons of Liberty are almost literally up in arms. Okay. There were all kinds of confrontations wherever you get to the ports of Boston or New York or Philadelphia, etc. And these particular taxes and import duties are going to inflame the colonists and the British. There is what you're going to see is something called the Quartering Act. Great Britain are going to start treating Massachusetts in particular like it was an occupied city. And you'll see in the first episode, as the first episode of John Adams begins, we see a contingent of British troops being confronted by Sons of Liberty. And on March the 5th, 1770, what's depicted in the first scenes of John Adams, episode 1, is what is known in American history as I'm going to put the air quotes up, the Boston Massacre. Okay. Yes, it was in Boston. Was it a massacre? Yes. 5 British Bostonians end up dead, and they're fired upon by British redcoat soldiers. Okay. Was it a massacre? Well, I'll talk about that next when I talk about the first episode of John Adams, the miniseries from HBO.